Redditors whose life was changed by a DNA test. What happened? My mom took a DNA test, and she chose the option that allowed her to be connected with family members. She has a half-brother, who was put up for adoption as he was the result of a fling her father had with an old girlfriend. The two were forced to break up because she was heavily religious and teen pregnancy was frowned upon, so she also had to give up the baby. My mother's side of the family never knew about him before last year. My grandfather also managed to keep the secret for 60+ years, which is kind of impressive. He's a pretty cool dude, and he looks and acts almost exactly like my grandfather did. I'm so glad that my mother and him found each other. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to miss out on growing up with one of your siblings. I'm also happy for him for being able to find his biological family. Turns out he lived 20 minutes away from us for his whole life, and we had no idea. We even went to the same family doctor. We also ended up helping him find and contact his mother who gave him up, and everything turned out pretty good. The only downside is, after finding out about the whole thing, his wife got jealous of him spending time with all of his long lost siblings, and they ended up getting divorced. But he seems happier without her, and he just recently started dating another woman. Maybe having a bigger family gave him the courage to finally leave. My dad and his two siblings found out they all have different fathers. One other brother has already passed, so we'll never know if there was a fourth baby daddy or not. My dad is a junior and named his son the third after a man who it turns out is no relation. Our last name is an Irish name and we're 0% Irish, as his bio father was likely 100% German. My grandmother was a quiet, devout Catholic woman as far as I always knew, so it's been wild finding out she had some major secrets. If they all have different fathers, it's entirely possible they were sperm donor babies. The history of sperm donation actually goes back further than people realize, and if none of the kids turn out to be the putative fathers, my first thought is sperm donation, not necessarily an affair. My life wasn't changed, but I was contacted by someone on 23andMe wondering how we were connected since he thought he knew all his second cousins in the area. I recognized the surname as that of my biological grandfather. I answered this man's question by detailing how my grandfather had gotten my grandmother pregnant out of wedlock. Then it turned out he was already married with a family, forcing my father to be put up for adoption. I guess the guy didn't like that story and blocked me. I was adopted at birth back in the 1960s. I had a happy childhood, but both of my adoptive parents died of cancer in the early 1990s. I sent my DNA into Ancestry in the hope that I'd make contact with one or both of my birth parents. Literally all I had was my mother's name on the birth certificate and my father's name on a photocopied set of adoption paperwork. When I first checked the result, I was disappointed to find only a few third and fourth cousins. I emailed the ones who looked as if they visited the site regularly. It turned out they were all related to my birth father. He had also died sometime in the early 1990s. Then one day I logged back onto the site and found that I'd matched with a first cousin. I sent a tentative email saying that I'd been given up as a baby and appreciated that it was a sensitive family matter and that if he didn't want to get involved I was fine with that. But could he give me some more information about my family? He replied the next day and told me he was my uncle, and that my mother was still alive. She had given birth to me as a teenager, but had reluctantly had to give me up as her family was religious and birth dad was a deadbeat. He sent her a card saying sorry and a £20 note when he heard she'd had me, then married someone else. I made contact with her by email earlier this year. It turns out I have a half brother and sister, as well as nieces and nephews. We are taking things slowly at the moment, but after so many years it's amazing to have a mother again. We have the same likes, dislikes and politics. I'm hoping to meet up with her next year. I'm glad things have worked out well for you and your family. My mother passed away a few weeks ago and I found adoption papers hidden away in her stuff. So I have a half brother out there somewhere that I never knew about. I don't know whether to try and reach out to him or not. Like you said, it's a sensitive matter. I ordered one of the earlier versions of 23andMe back in 2013. Looked through some fun generic traits and ancestral history, then forgot about it for a few years. Until one day in 2017 when I received an email that a close relative was discovered. The connection listed them as a first cousin, which was weird because I thought that I had no immediate cousins and no one in my family recognized the name. A few months later, another one was added and finally a third a couple of months after that. Turns out my uncle has multiple illegitimate children and they all took DNA tests around the same time. All 3 of them found out that he was their dad thanks to my initial result connecting them and working together to compare family history. They're older, 30s to 40s, so it's more of a peace of mind at this point in their lives, but I'm glad that they were able to find their real dad through the experience. My family has been just my mom and I, and our dogs, for a while now. I took one and pretty much got exactly what I expected. My mom took hers and it came back that she wasn't Jewish at all. This was extremely confusing because her father and his family escaped the Nazis. Her father was definitely Jewish. She immediately knew he wasn't her father. It was horrible at first. My mom was devastated, as I'm sure you can imagine. She lost part of her identity. She looked at the part that connects you to people in your family and found someone listed under close relative whom she had never heard of. This person was listed as first cousin for me too. My mom's parents hadn't spoken to her in decades, so there was no asking them. She reached out to the close relative and found out that his parents lived next door to my mom's parents before my mom turned 1. My mom remembered a rumor that one of her cousins told her when she was little. Her mom had an affair with the next door neighbor. Turns out, the next door neighbor was my mom's real father. He has 3 kids around my mom's age, one is 3 months younger than her, and 3 kids about 30 years younger. As you can see, he got around LOL. He passed away a few years back, but the family welcomed us with open arms. When we met them, it was an instant connection, like we had been a part of their lives forever. They brought out pictures, and boy does my mom look like her father. They told me that my grandpa would be so proud of me and my accomplishments. Some of our interests and talents aligned. They told us we looked like the rest of the family, and we did. We never had that before. My mom and I went from only having each other, to her having 6 siblings, having nieces and nephews and me having aunts and uncles and tons of cousins and a family reunion to go to each summer. I have family in 5 different states, little cousins to teach, and big cousins to look up to. My mom has a huge family, and so many people to call and talk to and to ask her how she's doing. It's amazing to watch. Weddings, birthday parties, and lots of love. Funerals too. One of my uncles passed away, but I got a chance to meet him before he did. I think he was waiting to meet my mom and me. He was an amazing person, and even though I didn't know him for long, I loved him. My family has turned this into the best experience of my life, and my mom's too. To answer some questions, we took the test in 2017. My mom grew up with toxic abusive parents, and they cut her off at 19. Judaism can be tested for because we are an ethnic group with certain genetic markers. This one is really nice. I'm happy for you guys. This is not exactly the type of DNA test people would expect, but I've suffered from pretty awful mental health issues since I was a child. Eating disorders, general social anxiety, OCD, depression, and as of a few years ago, psychosis. By the time I was 16, I had been on well over a dozen different mental health medications with little to no help and a lot of side effects. My mom's schizophrenia kicked in when I was 2 years old. She had it under control for a while, but as I grew up, I basically watched it take over her. It started with little things like putting the TV remote inside the fridge. Next, I was having to put out fires and clean up her burn wounds because she'd try to cook directly on the stovetop, no pot pan. And eventually led to me having to lock myself in a room because the voices had told her she had to kill me. So when I turned 18 and started showing very mild signs of psychosis symptoms myself, my doctor was very diligent in getting it under control as fast as possible. Treatment was extensive, but part of getting better involved going through a clinical trial for my condition that involved having my DNA tested. I don't know exactly how it works, but they used my DNA to find out what medication would be the perfect fit for me to help with my mental health without having to deal with negative side effects. I still suffer from mental health, but more so anxiety symptoms than anything else, and have graduated from the psychosis intervention program I was in since my symptoms are almost entirely gone in that department. For a long time one of my biggest fears was that my son would grow up like I did, watching my mom's sickness take control. But now I truly feel as if I am the one that is in control, and it's a great feeling. This is awesome, and I am so happy for you. My sister has dealt with episodes of psychosis as well, and it's been tough. That's awesome that you've found the right medication and taken big steps towards leading your life. My friend did a test to see what her ancestry is recently. She ended up discovering who her dad actually is and learning that her dad is still alive, not dead like her mother said. So that's something. My life wasn't changed, but it was made a little more complete. Found out, along with my dad, when I was a teenager, that my grandpa wasn't my real grandpa. My grandma, who survived her husband back in early 90s, told us late in her life in the mid 2000s that her husband was sterile, so she slept with this other guy. Let's call him Tom Thompson. My dad had no idea and was in his late 40s when this news came to us. For 5 years off and on I searched all public records to find any trace of this Tom Thompson and found nothing. My grandma was going senile, so although I believe she had an affair, I didn't believe all the info she spewed out about Tom being a war pilot and having done amazing adventures. Did my DNA test just for the heck of it last year and found out that Tom Thompson does exist, and he was a war pilot, and everything else she said about him checked out. I'm now connected to my cousins on my dad's side, and it's been really warming to get closer to a family I never knew. That's pretty cool that it checked out. Both my partner and I tested positive as cystic fibrosis carriers. I don't know the exact chances of this, but it's low. None of our family members have CF. This was after we had our first child, who luckily does not have CF, but has really changed how we feel about any more children. I have a friend who was a carrier and her husband was too. She had 2 children with CF. Her son lived to be 8 and her daughter passed away at 16. Very sad. I guess when they had the second child they were hoping to be that 1 in 4. I had a very rare cancer as a child. I was always worried that any children I might have would suffer the same fate. When my wife and I got serious about parenthood, I learned that there was a genetic test for the type of cancer I had. I submitted a sample and it came back completely negative for any cancer markers, meaning my kids would have essentially no chance of developing the same disease. This was a huge relief, but at the same time it meant that my cancer was completely spontaneous, which changed an incredibly rare cancer into an almost impossible cancer. This profoundly illustrated just how little control we humans have over our fate. My entire life I was told I was heavily Native American. So much so, in fact, my granddad was a Cherokee chief and he gave all of his grandkids Native American names. I have 0% Native American and I'm mostly Irish and Scandinavian. I dunno man, my 23andMe also showed up no native, but my grandmother on dad's side is literally half. Blood tested and reservation registered. It's pretty wild. We are all related by blood too. I also showed up Portuguese and no one else in my family did, but still enough DNA to say yeah, he's your dad, he's your brother, she's your mom, etc. Okay, so my mom is Korean and my dad says he's white. He's also quite sectarian. Yes, I understand the ridiculousness of that statement, whereas he does not, and was always raving on about how he's Irish. I had the opportunity to take a DNA test for a study some friends of mine were doing in university. I got the results in, and to the surprise of no one, I'm roughly half Korean. The big shocker was the other half. I was only about 11% Irish. The rest, a healthy percentage of Syrian. He tried to say it was my mom. I then had the gleeful opportunity to point out that I didn't get 89% of my DNA from one person. Lmao, this one's funny. I bought my ex-husband and I 23andMe kits for Christmas one year. I am part black. That was a shocker. I don't claim it or anything though. I'm Snow White. He was adopted. All he knew from the adoption agency was that his mother was married at the time he was conceived, but her husband was not his father. My husband was the product of an affair. It was really neat when his results came back and he saw profiles of 3rd and 4th cousins. First time in his life he ever saw a picture of his blood relatives. One day he got a new match from someone. It said he was likely her uncle. As it turns out, it was his half-sister. As it turns out, his mother had 4 kids with 4 different baby daddies. He had 2 older siblings and one that is 10 years younger than him. His mother kept his other siblings but for whatever reason, put him up for adoption. Also, as it turns out, his mother is crazy as a bedbug. He eventually had to block her from calling because she was nuts. His adoptive family wasn't very good, there was some abuse, but his bio siblings have all told him they think he was the lucky one for having been adopted. I had been searching for my biological father for 10 years. When I took my DNA test and got the results back, I found out A. My bio father was 14 when I was born. B. My mom was 20 when I was born. C. My father died when he was 24. D. He was murdered by his best friend. E. That there was a Lifetime original TV series with an episode dedicated to his murder. F. That I had a half-brother. G. My half-brother didn't know the person he called dad his whole life wasn't his dad. Q. Existential crisis. Good lord. Growing up I had 2 half-brothers and 3 half-sisters from my parents' previous marriages. I was told that my father's wife had cheated on him with another woman and he caught her and that was the end of that. And my mom told me that he had caught her husband with another woman and so they divorced. They got married and had me. Hence I was the only child they had together. The sister closest to me in age. She is 6 years older than me. Got a DNA test done and lo and behold, she is my full sister. We had asked my father numerous times after my mother died if she was my full sister and he denied it till his dying day. She didn't get the test done until after he passed away. So my parents were having an affair for at least 6 years. It really hasn't changed my life though. I only have a relationship with my one brother and that's just fine with me. My brother and I did 23andMe tests and when we went to compare our results it said he was only my half brother. We thought we were full blood related our whole lives. Turns out, our biological mom, who has since abandoned us and passed away, cheated on my dad and made him believe the baby was his. My dad was 20 at the time and it's changed the whole course of his life. He loves my brother as his own but dang. It's cheesy, but I think this quote from Guardians of the Galaxy comes to my mind. He may have been your father, boy, but he wasn't your daddy. Your dad is his dad, no matter what. Didn't do DNA, but just the regular ancestry family tree. My family is very Norwegian, and tends to be very proud of this. Nobody had ever really done a comprehensive family tree before, since patronymics make that difficult. But I spent months matching records and going back as far as I could, before losing the trail sometime in the early 1700s. When Grandpa asked how my project was going at Thanksgiving, I asked him if he'd known his great-grandfather was Swedish. He was still complaining about it at Christmas. This revelation shattered his world for a little while. I am sorry, I know I shouldn't be laughing, but gosh, that is very funny. My husband has done 5 DNA tests to trace his ancestry and all have come back that they were unable to get results. Aliens? Just needs to spit better. My friend did hers and it took 3 times. She didn't follow the directions like she thought she was till someone helped her with it. A man contacted me out of the blue one day on Ancestry saying it showed we were related and he was looking for his birth parents. He was adopted and had been searching for a while for his mom and dad. He sends a picture and looks just like my dad. My sisters and I end up kind of tricking our dad into taking an ancestry test to make sure that they match and sure enough they do. He came from Houston to Knoxville to meet us and seems to be a great person. My dad apparently doesn't know who his mom is though because apparently he was kind of a man W in his younger years, probably now too. Anyway, that's the story of how I ended up with a half brother that's about 15 years older than me. Not my ancestry, but my partner found out their great-grandfather did not die in war like everyone believed. Turns out he started a new family across the ocean and abandoned his home life. How much do you hate or even just not care for your life that you decide to just drop everything? Not quite life-changing, but I've never known my father. He spilt from my mother before I was born and I never saw him. All my life my mother and family said he was Thai. I'm mixed race. Recently I took a DNA test and the result said I am 0% Thai. My mom recently found her birth mom from doing a DNA test, so now we know a little bit about our medical history. We have an entire family that we don't know obviously. and my mom knows why she was given up for adoption as a baby. Also, just to add a random tidbit, I said that now we know medical history because both my parents were adopted. My dad has met his birth mom, but my dad and siblings and I, are not super close, so I don't think we ever found out or asked about his history with his mom and why she gave him up, etc. We met her once, but I don't know if he's kept in contact with her, and I haven't heard about her in years. Not sure how he found her though. Not sure if it was because of a DNA test or not. My dad took a DNA test because his family background was extremely confusing. We always heard that my father's father was a politician or some government worker from Nicaragua. Well, lo and behold, my grandmother was telling the truth but never knew how to pronounce the politician's name as she was kidnapped and too young to remember the sperm donor's name. This guy was an extreme big shot, very close to the Nicaraguan president. Nice to know who he is finally, but frick him for taking advantage of my grandmother. As a side note, pretty cool to know 70% of my father's DNA is from Iberia. Oh, no, your poor grandmother. My 70-year-old father-in-law has known his whole life he was adopted. Last month, he found and met his biological sister. My dad got me an ancestry DNA test for last Christmas, which we did together. We found out he isn't my biological dad. So long story short, I now have 2 dads and 1 mom, and none of them are together. He already suspected. I have 1 full-blooded Native American ancestor. This did not change my life. What did was that through this I was able to find parts of my birth family, and they had family law that they were significantly Native American and sort of looked the part. I ended up telling them that they did have 1 ancestor, but 1 ancestor 5 generations back means basically nothing. Furthermore, my grandmother was forced into a marriage at 14 or 15 in some hick town in Idaho by her parents who wanted their friend to have a companion. That friend was in his 30s. She had 3 children popped out before she was 20. In the dark of night she escaped to California and married a new man that she lived the rest of her life with. Their younger son is my father. I was able to get in touch with children of the first marriage, and they had an attitude towards my grandmother that was not altogether undeserved. She did abandon them. After I added some context, they relaxed their judgments a bit. My heart goes out to your grandmother, and it's nice that her first kid didn't resent her as much. They probably didn't know the full story. Not my story. One of my best friends. She was conceived via sperm donor in the early 90s and grew up as an only child. No contact with a biological father. Flash forward 25 years and 23andMe is suddenly a thing. My friend does her DNA test. All is well and dandy. She signs up for the service that notifies you if they find familial matches. 3 months later, she gets notified of a paternal half-sister. They meet and become close. A few months after that, both are notified of a paternal half-brother. They meet him too and they all get along. And this new half-brother is also using a different DNA service and has found 2 other paternal half-siblings. Another brother and sister. The new sister was apparently hard up with legal trouble for child abuse. The new brother was adamantly against meeting his paternal family. He was against it because when he was 8, his mom paid someone to track down the bio dad and tried to force the 2 of them to have a relationship. It didn't go over well, but new bro did offer their biological dad's contact info to my friend and the rest. So after many months of debating, my friend, her first half sister, and her first half brother agree that they want to meet their biological dad. They reach out to him, explaining that there is no pressure if he doesn't want to know them, just a friendly outreach. Sperm donor responds and says he wants to meet them. They fly out and meet him, his wife, and their 5 kids. And sperm donor informs them that he knows of 2 more half siblings that they hadn't found yet. So for those who weren't keeping count, that is how my best friend went from being an only child to being one of 12. I found my birth parents. Birth mother is childless in, I think, Iowa or Ohio. Turns out she thought she wanted a child, then flipped out about 7 months into her pregnancy. Signed over all parental rights to my amazing birth father, who chose to place me in God's hands and let me live an incredible life with a set of the most wonderful parents a child could ever want. My birth parents were married, but estranged. My birth father never got to see me as a baby, so when we finally met on Easter Sunday, 2018, we were meeting for the very first time. It also turns out that he worked in the building my dad worked in and they knew each other. My dad died in May 2009, so he never got to formally meet my birth father. Finding my birth father has been the biggest blessing. He is such a nice man, and the fact that he wanted to ensure I had a better life gave me up for adoption. I am beyond grateful that the DNA test led me to learn about my history and brought a new side of a family to love. This sounds like an ad for an adoption agency. My mom did a DNA test for Christmas just to get a better understanding of her background. She's adopted, but has met her biological mother, bio-mom. Bio-mom had previously given us a first name and nationality of bio-dad but did not have any other information through which we could find him. When the results of the test came back, they had a 99% match with a full name for a biological father. This person was a completely different name and nationality than what bio-mom had told us. Also connected to this new father were names of women that would be my mom's half-sisters. My mom reached out to the new bio-dad and sisters with hopes that they would be willing to speak with her. One of the sisters has responded. Unfortunately, she says that her dad is a very private person, claims to have no recollection of meeting banging bio-mom, and is not interested in talking to my mom. I feel horrible for my mom. It wasn't her fault that she was born and it wasn't necessarily bio-dad's fault that this happened and he didn't know. But it did happen and I wish he could be at least open to talking to my mom. She doesn't want money or anything at all, just understanding of herself. I grew up being told that my father had died before I was born. When I was 14, my godmother got drunk one night and let it slip that my mom had been lying to me and my father was alive and well and living in another state. I did some research and tracked him down. He said that he knew about me and had even met me once when I was 6 or 7 and he was a guest at one of my mom's parties. I have no recollection of this. My mom had lots of parties and people in and out of her life. He said that he didn't think that he was my father because it was a one-night stand with my mom, but he would submit to a DNA test to be sure. This was a long time ago, and I had to go through the family court to get a paternity test back then, so obviously I had to tell my mom that my godmother had told her secret. My godmother was furious with me and never spoke to me again. She died 8 years later. She was a very wealthy woman with no children or close relatives left. I was originally going to inherit everything. She always told both me and my mother that she was leaving everything to me. She changed her will and left everything to the church instead. The DNA test did prove that he was in fact my father. We tried to maintain a relationship for a couple of years, but he never really wanted a kid and any effort towards a relationship on his part was half-assed. I haven't spoken to him since 2006. There was no falling out or argument during our last conversation, but when I hung up the phone after talking to him that day I just decided that I wasn't going to initiate our next conversation, like I always had before. I was just going to wait for him to call me. He never has, and my phone number hasn't changed. His has though. He moved to a different state. TLDR. Got a DNA test and lost a large inheritance, but gained a deadbeat dad. From a DNA test on ancestry.com found out my grandfather had another kid before he married my grandmother. That was a surprise but not life changing. The one that did was I found out the man I thought was my dad wasn't. My mom, him and an aunt kept it from me who my biological father was. I found out a few months ago. Poor guy had no idea I existed. I have 2 half brothers I didn't know about as well. Both older than me and they have a few kids so I am an aunt. To make things more complicated, the guy who I thought was my dad, his sister and her husband adopted me a few years ago. I hated being an orphan. Mom and guy I thought was my dad have both been dead for years and the state of Maryland allows for adult adoptions. So I had to tell her I am not a blood relation. Thankfully we agreed the adoption stands and doesn't change our relationship. In July 2020 I am going to meet my biological father, brothers and nieces and nephews. It has made me question my whole life. The guy who I thought was my dad was such a crap father. I can't help but think my childhood would have been so much better with my biological father. It also made me question if I wanted kids. I was a firm no based on my experience with the guy who I thought was my father, and whether I should move back to the US to be closer to family. I have been struggling with all this the last few months. I am so happy I get to meet my family, but also trying to understand why everyone kept this from me. Hope things go well with the July meeting. Quite a situation. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.